Welcome to Cliburn Masterpiece. I'm Buddy Bray. I'm your host for this series, and we come to you from the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Cliburn Masterpiece is a series in which we explore the greatest masterworks ever written for the piano. We hear performances by some of our Cliburn laureates, and we talk to other experts, both in and out of the field of music. Today on Cliburn Masterpiece, the Sonata No. 8 in B flat major by Sergei Prokofiev, one of his War Sonatas. We'll talk about what that means with 2017 Van Cliburn International Piano Competition finalist Georgy Tchaidze. We'll also explore Prokofiev's time and place during World War II with Peter Kupfer, who's an associate professor of musicology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Here's our conversation with Georgy Tchaidze and Peter Kupfer. I wonder if first you could help us sort of situate Prokofiev in the time and place that we're dealing with in this episode, which is the eve of World War II. Where is he? What's he doing at this time?
So Prokofiev, yes, it's even though the sonata that we're talking about here, the eighth, was composed during World War II, basically from 39 to 44. I think in order to situate Prokofiev, we really need to go back to before he even came to the Soviet Union, which was in 1936 is when he finally moved back permanently. And there's been a lot of speculation about why he did this, because it changed his career forever in good ways and also in bad ways. But I think the common thinking is that the Soviet Union offered him many, many opportunities for commissions, and at first they said he could travel freely and continue concertizing, but those rights were eventually all taken away. He had left the Soviet Union after the revolution, or Russia after the revolution, and but it turned out wherever he went, he was always the second Russian there. So when he went to Paris, he was the second Russian behind Stravinsky, who was doing all kinds of new things. When he was in the US, he was the second Russian behind Rachmaninoff, who was playing all kinds of concerts everywhere and was a big hit. And so when the Soviets approached him, they were trying to lure talent back. He thought this could be a good opportunity. They were throwing money and commissions at him, which he wasn't getting in the West. He was having trouble all over the place and getting a lot of his works premiered. So between 1933 and 36, he's actually spending a lot of time in the Soviet Union already, sort of traveling back and forth. And this is when he gets commissions for Romeo and Juliet and Peter and the Wolf.
When he came back to what was now the Soviet Union in 1936, he also, among the pieces like Peter and the Wolf and Romeo and Juliet that he wrote are also certain pieces like the cantata for the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, and a piece called Hail to Stalin, and Alexander Nevsky, and pieces like this. Now, how does that square with the rest of his output? Was he impressed in a sort of 19th century way to write these pieces, do you think?
It's a difficult question. We don't know exactly what his psychology when it comes to these kinds of things, but we do know that he wrote all these pieces that you mentioned, and many more that were overtly ideological. Part of it was that they were very lucrative commissions much of the time. He made a lot of money off these kinds of pieces. He was rare among Soviet composers in that he had relatively free reign after 1936 and 37, more so than, say, Shostakovich, who had been censured, of course, in 1936. In fact, Prokofiev returned to the Soviet Union 2 months after the famous Muddle Instead of Music editorial that took down Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth. And so, but Prokofiev saw this as an opportunity. He said, that guy's now not number one. Here's my chance to move in. So he knew that part of this deal, so to speak, was to write these ideological pieces.
I want to know if he stayed in one place during the war.
He had to move a few times due to evacuation. So he was in Moscow when the invasion happened in June of 41, and then I believe he was evacuated shortly thereafter, a couple months later. The first time to Tbilisi, which is in Georgia, capital of Georgia, and then later he was in Perm for a while, and he sort of had to move from place to place. He did come back to Moscow for a few months to attend a reading of War and Peace but he didn't return permanently until 1943. But it was difficult to find food and to find money, and it was just difficult working conditions. And he also had to make a lot of money, as much money as he could, to send back to his wife or his ex-wife and sons back in Moscow. That's a whole nother interesting part of this story. He was seen, as like Stravinsky and like Rachmaninoff, as an avant-garde composer. He was writing pretty modern and dissonant works in the early 20s. He had made a decision on his own to turn to a simpler style, as he called it. Now, often people think that he turned to this simpler style when he went back to the Soviet Union because of socialist realism, as we'll discuss a little later, I'm sure. But he had actually made this decision before he went back. Because he realized his avant-garde, dissonant, difficult music was not hitting the mark, as it were.
His simplicity you can still see in these War Sonatas 6, 7, and 8. They are legible to an audience. They're not willfully obscure. But I do want to talk about certain concepts that Prokofiev would have had to confront in this time and place. One is the concept, the term socialist realism. Can you tell us what that was and how that let the hammer down on certain composers in that time and place, Prokofiev and Shostakovich, for instance? What was that?
Well, socialist realism is a nebulous term, and that is what gave it its power. It was defined first in relation to literature, that it basically meant that new works of art in literature, film, music, all the arts, they were supposed to be accessible. They were supposed to promote the ideology of the regime, and they were supposed to be socialist in content. Now, there was nothing really more explicit than that, and that's what gave it its power, is that then the officials who went about evaluating these works could say, well, I don't think that's quite socialist or that's quite realist. In practice, for musicians, what it meant is writing works that were more accessible, ideally based on some story, even with a text, so operas and oratorios and cantatas were great for this. The counterpart to socialist realism was the idea of formalism. So any music that was, in a sense, music about musical play, or playing with form, playing with harmony, playing with orchestration, anything that was kind of sarcastic or fun, basically anything that was avant-garde or modern, was considered formalist and therefore not appropriate.
That's another thing, another very important concept to get to when we're talking about these war sonatas, because they are works sort of about themselves in a way. They do follow the sort of tropes of sonata form. They're in 3 movements or 4 movements. The middle movement is a slow movement. The sonata allegro forms the first movement. So all 3 are broken down in a very predictable sort of way. So would he have come in for criticism for being too formalist in works like the War Sonatas?
No, in fact, the War Sonatas were very well received, especially the 7th and 8th, both of which won Stalin prizes. And even though these are small instrumental works, as piano sonatas, which were considered will always have been considered more private kinds of works, they nevertheless returned, as you say, to a more accessible instrumental style for Prokofiev. Although I wouldn't say returned at that time. He had been writing in that style for quite some time. But the other works he was writing during this period, for example, Ivan the Terrible, the music for that Eisenstein film, and he was working on War and Peace and Cinderella. Those are even more accessible, more straightforward, if you will, in some ways. So these piano sonatas, they've been described as enigmatic and radical, but that has to be understood in the context of what else he was writing at that time.
We don't talk so much about Prokofiev's influences really in his music. We don't talk about it nearly as much as we talk about Shostakovich, for instance, embedding quotations in his music, because those are very clever and they're very legible in a way. Did Prokofiev ever traffic in anything like that?
Not generally. And he prided himself on being an originalist and sort of writing all his his own melodies, his own ideas. Even though he did reuse a lot of his own music, he's not known for quoting other composers very much. Even though we call him a Russian composer, that idea is often associated with this kind of 19th century Russian, the mighty handful sound. But he rarely wrote in that style. He really had his own personal, unique sound. However, in the eighth sonata, I think that there's a quote in the first movement, and it comes back in the last movement from Schubert's A Winter's Journey, Die Winterreise, particularly the last song called Der Leiermann, the hurdy-gurdy man, in which the protagonist arrives in this cold snowy street, and he hears a hurdy-gurdy man who's playing his his hurdy-gurdy, but the idea of the song is that no one hears him, no one sees him, and then of course the idea is he really there, or has the protagonist died? There's sort of ambiguity there. But so this little hurdy-gurdy melody, I believe Prokofiev quotes in the first and the last movement.
When we're talking about Winterreise, we're talking about a cycle. The pervading sense of that cycle is one of desolation and melancholy, and we certainly do have that atmosphere, at least in the second movement of the eighth sonata as well. There is a sense of resignation right at the very beginning. It's very lyrical. It's beautiful. It's achingly beautiful. Do you find it to have a different atmosphere about it, a different feeling than the sixth sonata, for instance, or the seventh sonata? How does it feel differently from those two?
One of his most large-scaled works, and very beautiful sonata. But beauty of this sonata is very complicated. It's not easy to access this emotional world which the sonata can provide.
The eighth sonata is different from the sixth and seventh, even though they're grouped together. He even himself described the sixth and seventh in this more vigorous toccata-like style, very energetic. But the eighth is much more reserved, resigned, as you say. It's been called enigmatic. And some of this perhaps has to do with his feelings about the war. As I said, we don't know exactly when he wrote it. He said he was influenced by his new love with Mira Mendelssohn, so perhaps there's some sense of that in there. But it is certainly more lyrical and quieter than those other two.
It doesn't bring so many emotions at first, yeah, and then of course he's using this material, thematical material, to bring us more, yeah, and then all the themes which are represented in the beginning in this introduction section actually developing, and it leads to very strong emotional collapses, I would say, yeah. So, but in the beginning, first pages of this sonata, they are still very calm.
And then what happens? Because we really do change gears there.
Same music from
right,
and actually
right.
Kind of music is actually kind of the same. This nervosity, which also reminds us about Shostakovich music, for example. Of course, it's all about war, about images of war, images of this horrible time, and we have to remind us that this sonata was written during the war. And I think it's very important that this music is not only about the war. Also, this music is about this whole atmosphere of terror, atmosphere in Russia, in Soviet Russia at this time, about fear, about horror, and many other unpleasant things. So I think this image, which appears on one of the very first pages, is actually representing this kind of nervosity, yeah.
You're talking about the sort of the atmosphere of being nervous, of being unsettled in an atmosphere of war. Things are a little bit unstable, and certainly that is brought to bear in all three of these sonatas we've been talking about. Can we talk a little bit about the technical, just the technical challenges?
I think it's very Prokofiev-like. He loved to do this kind of, because he was a marvelous pianist himself, and he surprised pianists with all those little inventions. And when we are talking about technical things, of course, we have to remember that he had very special, very original approach to piano playing himself. His way of playing was slightly different. It was not very romantical. It was not something like Scriabin or Joseph Hoffman or something. It was very direct, you know.
Can we talk about the second movement for a little, because it's not virtuoso, the second movement, and what I think is sort of fascinating about the war sonatas is that their slow movements are all in a triple meter, and they're all sort of nostalgic,
Yeah.
in a way. What sort of feelings does it bring to mind for you when you're playing it?
It's a mix of feeling. Of course, as you said, it's very melancholic, very nostalgic, but with lots of irony as well. And you know, I think it's so Prokofiev actually. You know, he was a big master of writing dance music, and I think this is something which actually comes from his childhood, from his very first experience of composing when he was a little boy, wunderkind, we would say, and he was studying with famous Russian composer Reingold Glier, and he commissioned little Sergei to write little pieces, and most of them are dances. And then later, when we observe his legacy, we will see that he actually, all his life, he was writing those little dances, waltzes, gavottes, bourrée, and so on. And probably that's why he later came to ballet music, and he wrote his famous Romeo and Juliet, and so on and so on. You know, so of course this detail we have to remember, but also when we put it in the context of war, of horror, this music is kind of island of peace, island of how life would look without war and without all those terrible things which have happened at this time. Yeah.
I'm so happy that you were referencing his ballet music, because this movement does feel and sound a little bit like his great waltzes in Romeo and Juliet and in Cinderella. It seems to me the last movement of this sonata is a little bit less directly a toccata. You know, the seventh sonata is just relentless. It starts and it just is the same sort of feeling, the same sort of mood for 4 minutes. This is very different sort of atmosphere, really. And then it has that surprise in the middle.
Well, for me, both of those elements. So the first element is this toccata-like movement, and the second is a middle episode. Both of them are pure evil, I would say. It's a very disturbing musical image, I would say, and it's like a very appropriate answer to reality, to the horror of reality, yeah, and I think it represents kind of destroying power. And then in the middle section, I always thinking about Shostakovich famous C7 symphony when I listen to this music. Again, we have the same pattern. We have a very easy melody which appears at first. It's almost very naive, and it brings us, I don't know, images of I don't know, of pioneer movement in Soviet Russia or Hitler Jugend in Germany at this time. We could think about this, why not? But then we see this very complex development, yeah, into the complete catastrophe, yeah, because at a certain point it sounds like absurd, like a nonsense, like a complete disaster. And this is absolutely fascinating place where I think Prokofiev was like on the top of his composing abilities, because he combined elements from first movement, from thematical elements from the third movement itself, all together, and it sounds like a big symphonical culmination.
I've always thought that this was one of the most Shostakovich-y things he ever did. It's that our sarcasmus that Shostakovich always seemed to have that I find in this middle section. Okay, can we talk about this coda? Can you make me feel better about it that I had to practice it for so long?
This music is ideal. It will be never played like it's it's just a complete mess, you know, complete mess. And the most important is the idea of madness, but not madness itself. You don't need to be perfect about madness. You know, you don't have to play every note. It's just a very large scaled picture of forces of evil which actually won. Music at a certain point sounds like a triumph, but it also makes me think about last movements of Tchaikovsky's symphony. For instance, Symphony Number 5, which also sounds like a triumph, but doesn't feel like a triumph of good thing over the bad things. You know, it's also feels a bit evil.
It helps to explain what happens, which sounds like an ending, but isn't the ending. It helps to explain those last few bars that the evil is not actually
And
gone.
certainly the message, right? It feels like a message.
Mhm.
It's not over, and it will be not over soon. Yeah.
And from the 2017 edition of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition, here is finalist Georgy Tchaidze playing Prokofiev's Sonata for Piano Number 8, Opus 84. thrilling performance of Prokofiev's Sonata No. 8 in B-flat major. That was 2017 Van Cliburn International Piano Competition finalist, Georgy Tchaidze. Our thanks to Georgy for talking to us about Prokofiev and for playing the piano so beautifully in that performance. Also, our deep thanks to Peter Kupfer for contextualizing Prokofiev a little bit for us today. I'm Buddy Bray. Thanks so much for watching Cliburn Masterpiece.